World powers are continuing talks with Iran over its nuclear program. A senior US administration official told the FT that the atmosphere at the talks so far has been positive, and there are hopes that an interim agreement could finally be reached after 10 years of on-off negotiations. Well, joining me now to talk about it is our diplomatic editor, James Blitz. James, talks which are taking place in Switzerland at the moment are ongoing. What's your assessment of how they've gone so far on both sides?
Well, as we speak, we're into the first day of 2, possibly 3 days of talks. It's really difficult to know. My assumption has always been that they would end up doing a deal this week, but the early signs are from Geneva that things are not going too well. There's been some talk from both the US and the Iranians about how it might be quite difficult to get a deal done this time. If that's the case, then the bigger question that will arise is whether this now provides an opportunity for Congress in the US to slap a whole load more sanctions on the Iranians, and that would be very worrying. So I think they need to try and get a deal done this week if at all possible. Whether they can bridge the gap, we just don't know.
Now, previous talks broke down due to Iran wanting recognition of its right to enrich uranium at a civil level. Will that be the main stumbling block to negotiations again, do you think?
Well, it's an issue. Iran has said all along that if it's to sign this interim deal, which is a 6-month agreement to arrest its program, it wants to be given an assurance by the US that at the end of the entire negotiation, it will have a right to enrich uranium, as you say, for civil nuclear power. Now, I think the US is prepared to give that right. It's prepared to accept it. Israel doesn't want that, but the US is prepared to. The trouble is it requires a very explicit statement by the US, and that's difficult because that would give a right to other countries to go ahead and do the same thing. But it's a question of how the language is found for that.
Now, what about the timing of this thing? How important do you think it is that a deal is done quickly?
It's very important indeed. First of all, it's important, as I say, because the US Congress, Republicans in Congress, want to slam a whole load more sanctions on the Iranians effectively to seal off their economy completely. If that happens, I think the whole process is going to break down completely. The Iranians won't come back. Secondly, I think Rouhani, the president of Iran, needs an early success. He was elected in June to show the Iranian people that he was able to lift sanctions, and so that's important. And the other factor as well alongside all of this is that the Iranian nuclear program is proceeding. They are getting closer to the point where they will be able to be on the threshold of having a nuclear weapons test, and that might come in the middle of next year. So they need a deal very quickly.
And if a deal is done, do you think it can hold, or will it come under pressure from Congress, from Israel and from hardliners in Iran?
It will come under pressure from all three. Even if an interim deal is passed, I think we'll have to see whether the US Congress still has the appetite for more sanctions. That would be worrying. I think Israel will be very critical indeed, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been critical for the last few days. But I have to say that's because Israel's at the maximum point of its leverage now. It wants to convince the Americans to come up with a really tough bargain with the Iranians. Whether they'll continue after a deal's done, I'm not so sure. And then finally, there's the Iranian hardliners. There's the people around Khamenei, the Iranian president, who don't want this deal to surrender very much of the Iranian program. But the major thing, if something is passed, will be Congress. The first and important thing to look at will be whether Congress backs off and doesn't go ahead with more sanctions.
Okay, James, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.